to thank Strong America Now for their demonstrated leadership, and also they have been prophetic in the midst of this debt crisis, haven't they? Here was a plan. Now this is what's remarkable. In the midst of all of this economic chaos that we have seen, President Obama has yet to reveal one plan, not any plan, for taking us into economic prosperity. This is beyond belief. The president has been absolutely AWOL in the midst of this discussion. As we have seen our United States economy literally melting in front of our eyes, as we have seen the number of employed across America swell to over 14 million Americans, what has the president done? He's been AWOL. Where was the President of the United States when he couldn't do enough during his candidacy for the presidency to every day tackle President Bush on his big deficits? And we all agreed they were big. Because in the worst year of President Bush, the largest annual deficit was $458 billion. That was in 2008. In 2007, the deficit was $160 billion. What's the deficit this year under President Obama? It's $1.5 trillion. So while President Obama was harping on the previous administration and blaming them for all of his woes, President Obama, almost by a factor of 10, increased the national debt. And in the worst year under President Bush, his predecessor, he's almost tripled that national debt. One thing I learned, being born and being raised here in Iowa and Waterloo and Cedar Falls, I learned from my reasonable, fair-minded family and my neighbors is that if you're in a hole, you stop digging. President Obama has done just the opposite. He decided to go out and hire a steam shovel to make that hole bigger. And what did he do when we came upon this next crisis that we're dealing with? It isn't like we didn't know that this debt ceiling crisis was coming. We knew. The president has had one policy after another. In January, his administration sent out a letter to members of Congress. I got the letter. And then that letter said, we have to increase the debt ceiling. We have to do something to deal with this issue. So he told all of us he knew in January, but in February he came out with his budget plan, the plan for failure, for $1.5 trillion more added to our debt. In that time, you would think, knowing that we've got this debt, he would come up with something. He would work with Joe Biden, who he put in charge of the Debt Reduction Committee. How did that work, having the vice president in charge of that committee? No laughing matter there. It didn't work because the president decided he was going to ignore that commission. Just like the 17 other commissions that have been created. I call them the 17 Rodney Dangerfield commissions because they get no respect from the presidents or anyone else in Washington, D.C. So now we have an 18th commission that has just been put together called a Super Congress, and they're not planning to even meet until the snow flies here in Iowa. They're not even planning to deal with our debt until November. I am here as a presidential candidate to say we can't wait another day to solve our debt problems. Because the problems aren't in the future, the problems are today. That's why in Washington, D.C., I have been leading on this issue for months. I was told that I was extreme. My position has been, you don't raise the debt ceiling, period. We've already got $14.3 trillion. How bad is this debt? I have been in Congress for 5 years. When I came into the United States Congress, the national debt, at least what's reported on the books, we know it's far worse than that, but what's on the books was $8.67 trillion in debt. What's the debt today, 5 years later? $14.3 trillion. Do you know how long it took us to get to $8.67 trillion in debt? It took us 219 years under our Constitution to get to $8.67 trillion. It took us a mere 5 years to add 75% again as much debt. And now earlier this week, the United States Congress, without my help, increased that debt by potentially as much as another $2.4 trillion. I knew it was wrong. I warned the president. I warned my fellow colleagues in Washington, D.C., and I stood alone as a voice crying in the wilderness saying, do not raise the debt ceiling. But what happened this week? It was absolutely historic and it was stunning. We haven't had a week like this in 80 years in our country. Never before have we raised the debt ceiling to $2.4 trillion. This is a case of first impression. The only time we ever raised the debt ceiling over $1 trillion was also under Barack Obama. And guess what? This $2.4 trillion which in essence doubles our debt that took us 219 years to get to, doubling it. This 16.7, almost $17 trillion in debt not only drowns us on one level, it leads to something far worse, and that's enormous job displacement and job loss across the country. This is something that we cannot abide. I know that. I've been visiting businesses all across Iowa. I'm a former federal tax litigation attorney. I have a doctorate degree in law. I have a postdoctorate degree in federal tax law from William & Mary. I spent my years working in the U.S. federal tax court, seeing how devastating high taxes are on farmers, on small businesses, on individuals, on families. My husband Marcus and I created our own small business from scratch. We came from very modest means families. We held 2 and 3 jobs to put ourselves through college. We got together a little bit of capital. We started a business. We've created jobs. By the way, we think it is a good thing to turn a profit in this country. It's not evil.
Yeah.
We stand for people who want to create a profit. We stand for job creators. And by the way, wouldn't it be wonderful to have someone who occupies the White House who's actually started a private business, who's run a private business, who signed the front of a paycheck, who signed the back of a paycheck? Just recently, our Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, who, by the way, had his own tax issues, he didn't know how to pay his own taxes, he was recently asked by former President Bill Clinton about what he was going to do when he's no longer Treasury Secretary. I put out a call last night calling on President Obama to fire Tim Geithner. As President of the United States, I would fire Tim Geithner. Former President Clinton asked Treasury Secretary Geithner, well, what are you going to do once you stop being the Treasury Secretary? What was his response? He said, and I quote, well, I've never had a real job before. Isn't that the problem with this White House? They put someone in charge of economic recovery, which, by the way, where is it? They put someone in charge of economic recovery who's never held a real job before. Maybe that's why every answer they have is more government, more spending, more taxes, more borrowing, more debt. And that's why what we're seeing is absolutely no possibility of economic recovery under this plan. I called on the President of the United States, who, by the way, yesterday in this historic week, again, we saw a historic debt level increase earlier this week, which I was the leading voice saying do not do. Later this week, we saw a historic, unprecedented fall in the stock market, the 9th worst day in the history of the stock market, a 512-point reduction. And then yesterday, for the first time in the history of the country, from the time that the ratings agencies came about in 1917, what World War I, what the Great Depression, what Vietnam, what Korea, what World War II, what the current crisis across the Middle East, what 911 was unable to do. This is the first president in the history of the country who, under his watch, we have seen a downgrade of United States credit. For the first time, it happened on his watch. Mr. President, You were AWOL. You were missing in action. You failed to put forward a plan, any plan, to bring us back to balance so that yesterday wouldn't occur. I did put forward a plan. Together with your congressman here in Iowa, Steve King, we put forward a plan that said this: do not raise the debt ceiling, number one. Number two, do not default on our debt. You do that by the revenues that come in, pay off the interest on the debt. That's what you do with your mortgage. If you want to stay in your house, you at least pay off the interest in your debt. We said pay off the interest on your debt. From there, don't make our military men and women like Captain Scott O'Grady, our heroes, whose very lives are on the line. Don't make them political pawns and tell them, gee, we don't know if you're going to get paid or not. That's ridiculous. We're a better country than that. We pay our military. We don't scare them. We don't scare their families.